Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. Holly's Malevolent Manuscript. Holly Arnold had always loved the Isle of Wight with its rolling hills, tranquil beaches, and quaint villages. It was the perfect place for a writer to find inspiration. After the sudden death of her husband, she had retreated to her ancestral home on the island, a large, crumbling Victorian house that had been in her family for generations. The isolation suited her, and she spent her days writing and her nights staring out at the sea, finding solace in the rhythmic crash of the waves. One evening, while exploring the dusty attic, Holly stumbled upon an old wooden chest. Intrigued, she pried it open, coughing as a cloud of dust enveloped her. Inside, she found an assortment of old letters, photographs, and at the bottom a thick, leather-bound manuscript. Its cover was worn and cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. The title, written in an elegant script, read Tales of the Isle, a Chronicle of Unseen Horrors. Holly's curiosity was piqued. She carried the manuscript downstairs to her study and began to read. The first story told of a shipwreck that had occurred off the coast of the island in 1853. It described, in horrifying detail, how the crew had been lured to their deaths by ghostly apparitions. Holly shivered, the vivid description sending a chill down her spine. But what unsettled her the most was that she had never heard of this shipwreck before, despite her extensive knowledge of the island's history. As she continued to read, Holly realized that each tale was more gruesome than the last. There was a story about a plague that had wiped out an entire village, another about a haunted forest where those who entered were never seen again, and a particularly disturbing one about a family that had been driven to madness by a malevolent spirit. Each story was accompanied by intricate illustrations that seemed almost to move and writhe on the page. Despite the growing sense of unease, Holly couldn't stop reading. She was captivated by the manuscript, losing track of time as the hours slipped away. It wasn't until she reached the final story that she realized something truly terrifying. The events described in the manuscript were not just fictional tales from the past. They were predictions of future horrors. The last story was set in the present day and described the discovery of an old manuscript by a writer named Holly Arnold. The writer, it said, would be driven mad by the stories within, ultimately becoming a vessel for the malevolent forces described in the tales. Holly's blood ran cold as she read her own name. She looked around her study, half expecting to see some ghostly figure lurking in the shadows. Determined to understand the origin of the manuscript, Holly delved into her family's history. She discovered that it had been written by one of her ancestors, a reclusive writer named Edward Arnold, who had lived in the house during the mid-19th century. Edward had been known for his dark and macabre stories, but there were rumors that he had dabbled in the occult. According to family legend, Edward had made a pact with a dark entity, trading his soul for the ability to see into the future and write stories that would captivate and horrify readers for generations to come. The more Holly learned, the more she became convinced that the manuscript was cursed. She tried to burn it, but the pages refused to catch fire. She attempted to tear it apart, but the leather binding was impossibly strong. It seemed that the manuscript was indestructible, and its influence over her was growing stronger by the day. Holly's dreams became nightmares, filled with images from the stories she had read. She saw herself wandering through the haunted forest, her mind unraveling as the malevolent spirit whispered in her ear. She saw the plague-ridden village, its inhabitants clawing at their flesh as they succumbed to the disease. She saw the ghostly crew of the shipwreck, their hollow eyes staring at her as they reached out with skeletal hands. In desperation, Holly sought the help of a local historian, Dr. Emily Blackwood. Dr. Blackwood was initially skeptical, but after seeing the manuscript and hearing Holly's story, she agreed to help. Together, they scoured old records and ancient texts, searching for a way to break the curse. One night, as they were poring over a particularly old and fragile book, they found a reference to a ritual that could supposedly sever the connection between a cursed object and its victim. The ritual required a series of specific ingredients and had to be performed at midnight during a full moon, which was only a few days away. As the night of the full moon approached, Holly and Dr. Blackwood gathered the necessary items: a silver dagger, a vial of holy water, a sprig of rosemary, and a lock of Holly's hair. They made their way to an ancient stone circle on the outskirts of the island, the manuscript tucked under Holly's arm. The wind howled around them as they prepared for the ritual. Holly stood in the center of the circle, holding the manuscript, while Dr. Blackwood chanted the incantation. Holly felt a strange energy crackle in the air, and the manuscript began to vibrate in her hands. She recited the final words of the incantation, and with a surge of strength, she plunged the silver dagger into the manuscript. There was a blinding flash of light, and Holly was thrown backward, landing hard on the ground. When she opened her eyes, the manuscript was gone. She felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Dr. Blackwood helped her to her feet, and together they made their way back to the house. In the weeks that followed, Holly's nightmares ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the house lifted. She resumed her writing, finding joy in her work once more. The manuscript and its malevolent influence were gone, but the memory of its horrors lingered. Holly often thought about her ancestor, Edward Arnold, and the dark pact he had made. She wondered what had driven him to such desperation, and vowed to never let her own ambition lead her down a similar path. The Isle of Wight was her home, a place of beauty and peace, and she intended to keep it that way. One evening, as she sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the sea, Holly felt a strange sense of unease. She dismissed it as lingering paranoia, but when she glanced at the horizon, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a ship shrouded in mist, sailing toward the island. The ghostly crew, their hollow eyes fixed on her, had returned. The horrors of the manuscript were not so easily banished, and Holly knew that her battle was far from over. The malevolent forces that had plagued her ancestor were still at large, and they had set their sights on her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Holly steeled herself for the fight ahead. The Isle of Wight was her home, and she would protect it at all costs. The manuscript was gone, but its legacy of terror lived on. And Holly Arnold, armed with the knowledge and determination of her ancestors, was ready to face whatever horrors the future might bring. Holly stood on the porch, heart pounding as she watched the spectral ship drift closer. The night was eerily still, the usual sounds of the island's wildlife conspicuously absent. She had faced the manuscript and its horrors, but this was something new, something she hadn't anticipated. Determined not to be a passive victim, Holly decided to take action. She needed to know more about the ghostly ship and its crew. She returned to her study, searching through her family's old documents and journals. She found references to the shipwreck, scattered notes in Edward Arnold's handwriting that spoke of restless spirits and a curse bound to the island. Holly knew she needed help and reached out to Dr. Blackwood once more. The historian, though initially reluctant, agreed to assist. They spent the next few days gathering information and preparing for another confrontation with the supernatural. Dr. Blackwood suggested visiting the site of the shipwreck, hoping to find clues or remnants that might offer insight. On a misty morning, they set out to the rocky shores where the ship had met its fate. The site was desolate, waves crashing against jagged rocks, and an oppressive atmosphere hung over the place. As they searched, Holly found a piece of weathered wood half buried in the sand. It was part of the ship, and carved into it was a name, * the Sea Witch *. Dr. Blackwood's face paled as she explained that * the Sea Witch * was rumored to be captained by a notorious pirate who had made his own dark pact to ensure his and his crew's immortality. The legend spoke of a cursed treasure hidden somewhere on the island that bound the souls of the crew to the ship. Holly and Dr. Blackwood knew they had to find and destroy this treasure to break the curse once and for all. They spent days combing through records, interviewing locals, and exploring the island's caves and hidden coves. Their search led them to an ancient, overgrown cemetery where they found an unmarked grave. Digging through the earth, they uncovered a chest filled with gold coins, jewels, and a weathered map. The map, drawn in Edward Arnold's meticulous hand, led them to a hidden cave on the island's southern coast. Inside the cave, they found the cursed treasure, a chest filled with gold and silver, and a sinister-looking amulet that seemed to pulse with dark energy. As Holly reached for the amulet, a cold wind swept through the cave, and she heard whispers in an ancient, forgotten language. Dr. Blackwood began the ritual they had prepared, chanting words of protection and banishment. Holly held the amulet aloft and, with a final incantation, smashed it against the cave wall. A deafening roar echoed through the cave, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. The amulet shattered, releasing a blinding light that filled the cave. When the light faded, the amulet and the treasure were gone, replaced by a sense of calm. Holly and Dr. Blackwood emerged from the cave, exhausted but triumphant. They returned to Holly's house, hoping the destruction of the treasure had ended the curse. That night, Holly slept peacefully for the first time in months, free from nightmares and ghostly visions. The following morning, the island seemed brighter, as if a heavy veil had been lifted. Holly and Dr. Blackwood celebrated their victory, but they remained vigilant, aware that remnants of the past could still linger. Weeks turned into months, and life on the Isle of Wight returned to normal. Holly resumed her writing, and her works began to reflect the beauty and tranquility of the island rather than its dark past. She and Dr. Blackwood continued to explore the island's history, preserving its stories while ensuring that the darker ones remained buried. One evening, as Holly watched the sunset from her porch, she saw a familiar figure approaching. It was Dr. Blackwood, carrying an old, leather-bound book. Holly's heart skipped a beat as she recognized it was another manuscript, similar to the one she had destroyed. Dr. Blackwood explained that she had found it hidden in the archives of the local library, and it contained more tales of the island's haunted past. Together, they decided to study the manuscript carefully, determined to prevent any future horrors from emerging. As they delved into the new manuscript, Holly felt a sense of unease but also a steely resolve. The Isle of Wight was her home, and she would do whatever it took to protect it. The battle against the island's dark forces was far from over, but Holly was ready. She had faced the Malevolent manuscript and emerged stronger, and with Dr. Blackwood by her side, she would confront whatever new challenges lay ahead. The sun set over the sea, casting a golden glow over the island. Holly and Dr. Blackwood sat on the porch, the new manuscript open between them, and prepared for the next chapter of their journey. The horrors of the past might never be fully banished, but together they would ensure that the future remained bright and hopeful for the Isle of Wight. The following months saw Holly and Dr. Blackwood immersed in the new manuscript. Unlike the previous one, this tome seemed more cryptic, with stories that were fragmented and incomplete. Despite this, the sense of dread that emanated from the pages was palpable. Each story hinted at some greater malevolence, a darkness that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. One evening, while they were deep into the manuscript, Holly stumbled upon a particularly peculiar entry. It described an ancient ritual site located deep within the island's forest, a place where dark rituals had been performed centuries ago. The entry spoke of a great evil bound to the site, waiting for an opportunity to escape. Holly and Dr. Blackwood decided to investigate. They armed themselves with knowledge, carrying books of ancient spells, protective charms, and a map from the manuscript that marked the site's location. The forest was dense and overgrown, with twisted trees that seemed to reach out like skeletal hands. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. After hours of trekking, they arrived at a clearing. In the center stood a stone altar, covered in moss and lichen. The air around it was thick with an almost tangible darkness. Holly approached the altar cautiously, her heart pounding. She noticed ancient runes carved into the stone, faintly glowing with a sinister light. Dr. Blackwood began to decipher the runes, muttering incantations under her breath. Holly stood guard, feeling an increasing sense of unease. Suddenly, the ground beneath them started to tremble. A low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing, and the air grew colder. From the shadows emerged a figure, a tall, emaciated man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Holly recognized him from one of the manuscript's illustrations. He was Edward Arnold, or what remained of him. The dark pact he had made had transformed him into something monstrous. Edward's voice was a rasping whisper. "You shouldn't have come here, Holly," he said. The island's secrets were never meant to be uncovered. Holly stood her ground. "We're here to end this." "Your reign of terror ends tonight," Edward laughed. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The darkness is eternal, and it will consume you just as it did me." Dr. Blackwood completed her incantation, and a bright light erupted from the altar. Edward shrieked in pain, his form flickering like a candle flame. Holly seized the opportunity, reciting a banishment spell she had memorized from the manuscript. The light intensified, and Edward's screams grew louder, more desperate. The ground trembled violently, and the air crackled with energy. With a final, deafening roar, Edward's form disintegrated into shadows, which were sucked into the altar. The trembling stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the clearing. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Holly and Dr. Blackwood stood in stunned silence, the reality of what they had just accomplished slowly sinking in. As they made their way back to Holly's house, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The island seemed brighter, more alive, as if a great burden had been lifted. Holly and Dr. Blackwood were exhausted but triumphant. They had faced the island's darkest secret and emerged victorious. Back at the house, they carefully locked away the manuscript, knowing it was too dangerous to destroy but too important to leave unprotected. Holly resumed her writing, chronicling their adventures and ensuring that future generations would know the island's true history. The Isle of Wight flourished, its dark past gradually fading into legend. Holly and Dr. Blackwood continued their research, uncovering more of the island's secrets but always vigilant, always ready to confront whatever new challenges arose. Years passed, and Holly's tales of the island's history became renowned. She found peace in her work and in the knowledge that she had protected her home from the darkness that had once threatened to consume it. One evening, as she sat on her porch, watching the sunset over the sea, Holly felt a familiar sense of unease. She glanced at the horizon and saw, once again, the ghostly ship of Asterisk, the Sea Witch Asterisk, its spectral crew watching her. But this time she was not afraid. She knew that the island's true guardians, its people and their stories, would always prevail. The battle against the island's dark forces might never be fully over, but Holly was ready. The Isle of Wight was her home, and she would protect it with all her strength. And with Dr. Blackwood by her side, she knew they could face whatever new horrors the future might bring. The island, with its beauty and its shadows, was a part of her, and she was a part of it. Together they would endure, and together they would keep the darkness at bay. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.